My son-in-law lived across my own kitchen table, smiled the way people smile when they're about to say something they've rehearsed, and told me that maybe it was time I thought about a more manageable living situation. I set down my coffee mug, said that sounded reasonable, and excused myself to make a phone call. 6 weeks later, I was sitting on a terrace in Lisbon, watching the sun go down over the Tagus River, and he was explaining to my daughter why the lease on their new apartment cost 3 times what they budgeted. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and drop the city you're watching from in the comments below. My name is Beverly Ann McKetty, but I've gone by Bev my whole life, or 69 years of it, most of them spent in the same green-shuttered house on Sycamore Lane in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I taught third grade for 31 years. I raised my daughter Nadia, mostly on my own after my husband Thomas passed from a stroke when she was 14. I planted a vegetable garden every spring, kept the gutters clean, hosted Thanksgiving for whoever needed somewhere to go, and never once thought of myself as a burden to anyone. That last part was about to be tested. Thomas had been gone for 4 years when Nadia called to say she and her husband Jason were having some financial stress. The tech startup he'd been working for had folded. They were subletting their apartment in Charlotte and needed somewhere to land while they got back on their feet. Of course, I said yes. Nadia was my only child, my whole heart, and the house had 4 bedrooms and a yard that echoed when it was empty. I moved my sewing things to the corner of the basement, put fresh sheets on the guest bed, and drove to Costco like I was preparing for a winter. They arrived on a Tuesday in March with a moving truck, 2 cats, and a tension between them I could feel the moment they walked through the door. Jason was 38, the kind of man who described himself as an entrepreneur even when he wasn't currently employed. He had an easy charm that I'd liked well enough when Nadia first brought him home, back when he was finishing his MBA and full of ideas that sounded ambitious rather than exhausting. Now he had the look of someone who'd spent a long time blaming circumstances. Nadia was different too, quieter. She used to call me twice a week and laugh loudly at her own jokes. Now she laughed at his instead, and not always like she meant it. For the first 2 months, we found a rhythm. I cut most nights. They contributed when they remembered. Jason was home all day, supposedly job hunting, and I noticed that the job hunting often happened horizontally on the couch with the television on. Nadia had picked up remote contract work and was the one I heard typing late into the evenings. I bit my tongue. It wasn't my marriage. The small things started in May. I came home from my Tuesday volunteer shift at the Rappahannock Food Bank to find the living room furniture rearranged. My grandmother's rocking chair, the one I'd refinished myself, the one that had sat in that corner for 22 years, had been moved to the garage to make room for Jason's gaming setup. When I asked about it, Nadia looked uncomfortable and said Jason needed a dedicated workspace. I looked at the 3 monitors and the ergonomic chair that cost more than my property tax payment and said nothing. Then my parking spot in my own driveway became his. Then the small freezer I'd kept in the garage for garden produce was unplugged to make room for his bikes. I started to feel like a guest in my own house, which is a particular kind of disorientation, like someone has rearranged all the furniture inside you without asking. The conversation happened on a Saturday morning in June. I was at the kitchen counter slicing tomatoes from the garden when Jason came downstairs in the athletic clothes he wore to do nothing athletic and poured himself the coffee I had made. He sat at the table and was quiet for a moment in the way people are quiet when they're working up to something. "Bev," he said, "can we talk about the house situation?" I kept slicing. "Of course. Nadia and I have been talking. We think this house is a lot for you to manage on your own." I looked up. "I've managed it for 30 years. Sure, sure, he said, waving that away the way he waved away things that inconvenienced his point. But we're thinking long term. You're not getting any younger, and this place needs work. The roof's going to need replacing in a few years. The HVAC is old. It's a lot. I have a home repair fund, I said. I've always had a home repair fund. He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're not listening. Here's what we were thinking. If you transferred the house into our names, we could take over those responsibilities, handle everything. And you could look at some of the really nice, active senior communities around here. Hartwell Commons just opened a new wing. They've got a pool. I put down the knife. I want to be clear about what happened inside me in that moment. It wasn't panic. It wasn't even anger. Not yet. It was something colder. Clarity. Jason, I said, whose names are currently on this deed. Well, yours, but. Then the house is not a burden that needs to be transferred. It's my house, and I'm managing it fine. He leaned back and looked at me the way he looked at things he considered obstacles. Nadia agrees with me on this. That was the part that stung. Not him. I'd taken his measure already. But my daughter, the girl I put through college, the one I'd driven 4 hours each way to visit every other month. I kept my face still. Then I'd like to hear that from Nadia, I said. She came downstairs an hour later, looking like she hadn't slept. We sat on the back porch together in the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Mom, she started. He wants the house. A long pause. It's not like that. Sweetheart, it is exactly like that. She looked at her hands. We're struggling. If we had an asset like this, we could get a home equity line, invest in Jason's next venture. Jason's next venture. I said it without inflection. He's smart, Mum. He just needs. He needs my house. She didn't answer that, which was its own answer. How long do you want me to be out? I asked. We weren't thinking. Hartwell Commons is really. How long, Nadia? She was crying now, which I understood, but I also noticed she wasn't saying no. Maybe by the end of August. Jason found someone who does estate sale setups, and the master suite could be. I held up one hand. August is fine, I said. I'll figure it out. She reached for me. Mom. I love you, I said. I mean that completely, but I need to go make some phone calls. Where neither of them understood what I had never advertised was the shape of my financial life. Thomas had been a quiet, careful man, and one of the things he'd been careful about was making sure I would be all right without him. He'd had a life insurance policy, a pension from his 20 years in federal contracting, and the proceeds from a rental property he'd sold 2 years before he died. All of that had gone into accounts in my name, managed by a financial advisor I trusted named Arthur Webb at a firm in Richmond. I had also, in 31 years of teaching, accumulated a state pension that paid out monthly. I owned the house outright, no mortgage, paid off the year I turned 62, and it had been appraised 18 months ago at $387,000. Jason had assumed I was house rich and cash poor. Most people assume that about widowed retired teachers. They were wrong about me. I called Arthur that afternoon. He had the careful, unhurried manner of someone who has seen everything and is no longer surprised by any of it. I need to understand my full picture, I told him. Everything. We talked for 90 minutes. When we finished, I sat very still and let the numbers settle. Between the pension income, the investment accounts Thomas had left me, my own retirement savings, and whatever the house would sell for, I was looking at something I hadn't quite let myself see clearly before. I had options. Not polite options. Real ones. I'd been reading about Portugal for 2 years, the way you read about something you don't quite let yourself want. Thomas and I had talked about travelling after retirement. We never made it. I looked at the Portugal Golden Visa, looked at the cost of living in Lisbon, bookmarked apartment listings, and told myself it was just browsing. It was not just browsing. I spent the next 3 days researching with the same focus I used to bring to lesson planning, the NHR tax program for foreign retirees, the D7 passive income visa, the cost of a decent 2-bedroom apartment in the Alvalade neighborhood versus the Príncipe Real, the flight from Dallas to Lisbon, 8 hours. The average temperature in October, 70 degrees. On the 4th day, I called a real estate agent. Her name was Sandra Cho, and 3 houses on my block had sold through her office in the past 2 years. She arrived that Friday in a cream blazer, with a notepad and eyes that clocked every detail of the house in a way I found reassuring. She walked through slowly, asking good questions, touching the original crown molding in the dining room with genuine appreciation. You've kept this beautifully, she said. 30 years, I told her. It shows. She sat across from me at the kitchen table. Given the market right now, and what's sold comparable nearby, I'd list this at $379,000 to $389,000. I'd expect multiple offers, probably within a week, and the cash buyer could close in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Jason had given me until the end of August. It was June 14th. Let's list it, I said. Now? Friday. She blinked once. I'll draw up the paperwork tonight. After she left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time without turning on any lights. The evening came in through the windows the way it always did in summer, slow and orange, catching the dust above the table. I had eaten 30 years of meals in this kitchen. I'd cried in this kitchen after Thomas died. I'd helped Nadia with her college essays at this table, and we had laughed so hard one Christmas that coffee came out of her nose and we laughed harder. I was ready to leave it, I discovered. I had not expected that, but there it was. Nadia and Jason came home from wherever they'd been and moved through the house the way they'd started too, easily, as if it were already theirs. Jason made himself a sandwich and stood at the counter scrolling his phone. Nadia asked if I'd had dinner. I'm fine, I said. I've started making some arrangements. That's great, Mom. She sounded relieved. Hartwell Commons has an orientation. Not Hartwell Commons, I said. But thank you. She looked at me. Something in my voice, maybe. Where then? I'll let you know when it's settled, I said. Don't worry. I meant that completely. There was nothing to worry about. Not for me. The listing went live on a Thursday. By Sunday, I had 4 offers, including 2 cash. I accepted one at the $384,000 from a young family who had driven past the house for years, apparently, and always hoped it would come on the market. Sandra called to tell me, and I heard genuine warmth in her voice when she said the family had asked if they could keep the garden beds. Tell them the tomato plants need full sun and compost in the spring, I said. They'll do the rest. Closing was set for 31 days out. I spent those 31 days in a kind of organized quiet that felt better than anything had felt in months. I went through 30 years of accumulation with the decisiveness of someone who no longer had to justify anything to anyone. The furniture that had meaning I arranged to have shipped or stored. The rest I sold or donated. I gave Thomas's woodworking tools to the son of a colleague who I knew would use them. I gave my grandmother's rocking chair to my neighbor Francine, who had always admired it and deserved it. I booked my flight to Lisbon for 5 days after closing. Nadia noticed the for sale sign when she pulled into the driveway on a Tuesday evening. I was on the porch when she walked up, and I watched her read it twice. She stood there for a moment, then sat down on the porch steps without saying anything. You're selling, she said finally. Closing is in 3 weeks. Where? She stopped, started again. Where are you going to go? Lisbon, I said. Portugal. The silence lasted a while. Mom, she said, and her voice had shifted into something younger, something I recognized from when she was a teenager and had done something she couldn't quite take back. I didn't mean for it to be like this. I know you didn't. Jason said. I know what Jason said, and I know that you let him say it for both of you. That's the part I'd been sitting with. She turned to look at me. Her eyes were wet. Are you angry? I thought about that honestly. I was, for about 48 hours. Now I'm mostly just moving. But Lisbon, the word sounded foreign to her. You don't speak Portuguese. I'm learning. I've been doing the app for 2 months. I know how to order coffee and ask where the nearest pharmacy is. That's enough to start. She laughed, despite herself, a wet, surprised laugh that sounded like my daughter. Mom, I'm 69 years old, I said. I'm in good health. I have enough money to live well for the rest of my life, and the only reason I was still talking myself out of this was that I thought I was needed here. I paused. Turns out I'm more convenient than needed. Those are different things. She didn't defend against that. Good. It would have been the wrong moment to defend it. What about? She stopped. I waited. What about us, you and me? That, I said, is entirely up to you. Jason said very little when he found out, which told me he was calculating rather than feeling. He asked once, carefully, if I had considered a reverse mortgage instead of selling. I told him I had not and would not. He nodded and went back to his phone. He was not a bad man, exactly. He was a man who had looked at my life and seen an asset rather than a person, and I had stopped being willing to exist in that kind of arithmetic. Closing day was a Thursday in July. I signed the papers in Sandra's office, shook hands with the buying family, a couple in their early 30s with a daughter who had her father's nose, and walked out into the July heat with a cashier's check that represented 30 years of that house and Thomas's careful love for my future. I went home to Francine's guest room, where I'd been sleeping for the past week, and I called Arthur Webb. We talked for an hour about international account access, wire transfers, tax considerations for American citizens living abroad. Arthur had done this before with other retired clients, and he walked me through it with the calm of someone who finds international financial logistics genuinely interesting. By the time we hung up, the architecture of my life was fully portable. My flight left Alice at 6 in the evening. Nadia drove me. We were quiet most of the way, which was all right. Some things don't have the right words yet, and forcing them is worse than waiting. At the departure's drop-off, she got out and hugged me for a long time, her chin on my shoulder the way she used to do when she was small. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know, baby. Call me when you land." First thing. I watched her drive away and then went inside to check my bag. Lisbon opened itself to me slowly, the way cities do when you arrive without a plan to conquer them. The apartment I'd found online, a two-bedroom in Alvalade with high ceilings, old tile floors, and the balcony where I could watch the trams go by, was smaller than the Fredericksburg house and felt larger somehow. There was nothing in it that I hadn't chosen deliberately. Every object had earned its place. I started Portuguese lessons my second week, at a small language school near the Jardim da Estrela, where the class was mostly other expats, and two Brazilians who found our American accents deeply amusing. I found a farmer's market where the vendors were patient with my halting attempts at their language. I found a cafe where the owner, a compact man named Helio, started having my espresso ready by the time I reached the counter every morning. I found, to my own surprise, that I was not lonely. This was the thing I hadn't expected, the thing I suspect people expected me to discover to my cost. 69 years old, alone in a foreign city, widow, retired teacher. The narrative wrote itself as tragedy. But I had been lonelier in that house on Sycamore Lane in the last year, rattling around in the space between who I'd been and what I'd become to other people, than I was here, where I was simply Bev, who was learning to make bacalhau and had opinions about which hills were worth climbing. 3 months in, Jason called. The number came up as unknown, which meant he'd used a different phone, which meant he'd thought about whether I'd answer. I answered. Bev. He sounded smaller than I remembered. Not diminished exactly, but like he'd put down something heavy. "Jason," I said. "I wanted to. I owe you an apology for how things went." I waited. What I said, what we asked, it wasn't right. I convinced Nadia to go along with something that I framed as practical, but it was. He stopped. It was wrong. That's what I wanted to say. "Thank you for saying it," I said. "I've been trying to understand why I did it, why it seemed reasonable to me." A pause. "I think I stopped seeing you as a person who had a whole life of her own. I saw a house and a problem to solve." That's an honest thing to say. "I'm in therapy," he said. "Nadia too. Separately and together." "Good," I said. I meant it. "That's genuinely good, Jason. She misses you. I know you talk, but—" he paused. "She misses you the way she used to have you, before everything." "That's something she and I are working on," I said, "at her pace." He asked about Lisbon, and I told him about the market and the language school and Helio and his espresso. He listened in a way that felt genuine. Before we hung up, he said he hoped I was happy. "I'm more than happy," I said. "I'm interested. In my own life." I'd forgotten what that felt like. Nadia came to visit in October without Jason, which I thought was the right call for a first trip. She arrived looking tired and landed looking relieved, the way people look when they step into a place that has no memory of their worst moments. We spent 4 days walking the city. I showed her the market, the trams, the viewpoints, the miradoros, where the city unrolled below us in terracotta and white. She took photographs of everything. A dinner on the second night, at a little place near the river where the bacalhau was exactly right, she said quietly, "This is really your life." "It is," I said. "It's strange to see." She looked at me across the candlelight. "Not that strange. Just, I didn't know you wanted this." "Neither did I admitted. "Not until you both made it very clear there was no reason to stay." She flinched at that. I hadn't meant it as a strike, only as truth, and she knew the difference. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to be honest with me." "All right. Do you forgive me?" I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised who'd made a mistake big enough that she knew it as a mistake, which is not something everyone manages, and I thought about what the honest answer was. "I forgave you before Jason called," I said. "I needed to for my own sake, not yours. But what I need you to understand is that forgiveness doesn't mean we go back to where we were. We go forward from here, different, and hopefully better." She nodded, taking that in. "Are you coming back to the States?" "Not to stay," I said, "but to visit, yes. And you can come here. You can see that your mother is not a problem to be managed, and I can see that my daughter is growing into someone I'm proud of again." Her eyes filled. "I'm already proud of you." You should be, I said, which made her laugh and cry at the same time, which is a combination I've always loved in her. Back home. And I noticed I was calling Lisbon home without having to decide to. I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine and thought about the geometry of it all. Jason's small calculation, meant to make my life smaller, had instead removed the last reason I'd had to stay still. The house I'd loved was being loved by someone else now, and the roses I'd planted along the back fence were blooming for a family who sent me photographs. My daughter and I were speaking to each other for the first time in years with complete sentences, with real things in them. I looked out at the city and thought about Thomas. He had always said I was braver than I believed. I had not believed him, because I had nowhere to aim it. Now I did. I found I was not done being surprised by my own life. There was a watercolor class I'd signed up for, held in a studio near the Museu Nacional de Arte Antica, where the teacher was a severe woman in her 80s who communicated with students by pointing and sighing, and who had, the previous week, stood behind my work for a full minute before saying simply, "Better." That was the best thing anyone had said to me in months, and I was going back on Thursday. There was Helio at the cafe, who had started reserving a table in the corner for me on rainy days because, he said, he liked to watch the rain from the inside and figured I did too. He was right. There was a walking group I'd joined through the expat network, 12 people from 8 countries, who met every Saturday to climb a different hill and argue cheerfully about where to eat lunch. And there was this, the particular satisfaction of knowing that the life I was living was mine in a way it hadn't been for years. Not mine in contrast to someone else's claim on it. Just mine, chosen, tended, expanded every week in small ways that added up to something I had no name for yet but was learning, slowly and happily, to recognize. You don't need anyone's permission to want more from your life. Not at 40. Not at 69. Not ever. I used to believe that love meant making yourself smaller so the people you loved had more room. I know better now. The people who truly love you don't need you to disappear. They need you to be someone worth finding. I found myself. Took me 69 years and a son-in-law's bad arithmetic to do it. But here I am. What would you do if someone you loved made you feel like a problem to be solved? Drop your answer in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story found you at the right moment, there are 2 more waiting for you on the screen right now. I still think about the morning Jason sat across from me at my own kitchen table and called my house a burden. He said it gently, the way people say things they've decided in advance, and I remember nodding and thinking, he has no idea what I'm capable of. Not out of pride, just clarity. What happened to me and what happened to Jason and Nadia didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of choices accumulated quietly over months. They chose to treat my home like an inheritance, to be claimed rather than a life being lived. I chose, for too long, to make myself smaller so they'd be more comfortable. Every time I moved my things to accommodate theirs, every time I didn't say what I was thinking, I was teaching them that I had no edges, that I could be managed. The consequences of that came back to both of us in the end, just differently. I think about the woman I was before I booked that flight. She was good, she was competent, but she had stopped trusting her own judgment about what she deserved. That's a slow erosion, and it doesn't announce itself. You just wake up one day in a house full of other people's things, wondering how you became a guest in your own story. What pulled me out of it wasn't anger, though anger came. It was something I can only describe as a decision to think clearly, to sit with the actual numbers, the actual options, the actual geography of my situation. Thomas had left me resources I barely let myself look at directly, because looking at them would have meant admitting I could leave, and leaving felt selfish. It took being told to leave before I could choose it. That's the thing I want to say plainly. Choosing yourself is not the same as abandoning the people you love. I didn't leave Nadia. I left the version of my life where her comfort required my disappearance. There's a difference, and learning to see that difference clearly, to hold the line between love and self-erasure, is maybe the most important thing I've ever done. The courage it took to call Sandra, to sign those papers, to pack a bag for a country where I didn't speak the language, that didn't come from nowhere either. It came from 31 years of showing up for other people's children, from 30 years of maintaining a house by myself, from all the evidence I'd accumulated over a lifetime that I was, in fact, someone who figured things out. I just had to apply that evidence to myself. Helio has my espresso ready before I reach the counter now. My Portuguese teacher told me last week that my accent is acceptable, which from her is extraordinary praise. My daughter called on Tuesday just to talk, not to apologize, just to tell me about her week, and I sat on my balcony in the October sun and listened. and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. That's what doing right by yourself actually looks like from the inside. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just settled. Like you finally stopped arguing with your own life and started living it instead. I'm 69. I have watercolors to practice and hills to climb and a language to learn. I am not finished, not even close.